Greetings. My name is Charles Vardeman, and I am faculty in the Center for Research Computing at the University of Notre Dame. I'm also part of a National Science Foundation funded Cyber Infrastructure Center of Excellence called CI Compass. And our focus is to help major and mid-scale facilities with cyber infrastructure in respect to the data lifecycle. And that now includes how AI impacts these major facilities. And so this is a set of videos that I'm making in anticipation of a workshop that we're holding in January 2026, which is called AI meets CI, Intelligent Infrastructure for Major and Mid-Scale Facilities. We will provide links down below where you can go and register if you're affiliated with a major mid-scale facility. We hope that you'll come and participate in this 3-day workshop. All of these series of talks that I'm producing, so this is the third in the series of talks, sort of to demystify some of the jargon that's associated with generative AI and large language models. These are all available in our GitHub organization for CI Compass, AI and the Working Scientist, and these are all based off of Jupyter notebooks, which get rendered in GitHub, so you can just click on it. Wait a second, it'll come and load the whole thing. You can see the examples. You can click on the links and see what's helpful for you. Okay, so what is today's sort of topic? And just as a reminder, in the previous 2 videos, we talked about foundation models, what those are, how those work, and how a large language model essentially is a foundation model, how it works, and referenced Andre Karpathy's videos, which are very useful in providing understanding of a layman's approach of how these things work, to have the conceptual framework to be able to use these tools effectively. So this particular talk is about tools. And so in the last talk, when I talked about this idea of a context window, I mentioned that you can also have a context window which can do actions on the world, and that is called tool use, right? And so what does that actually mean? What's a tool? How do you build a tool? How do I think about tools? So this talk is meant to demystify it a little bit. And so my background is actually in theoretical chemistry. I am my PhD is in theoretical chemistry, so I tend to cast these things into scientific problems related to chemistry. But this is hopefully an example that's very general, and you can sort of understand how a Python function can be built to do some scientific calculation or some scientific tool use that then lets the model do things that are in a much more trusted, transparent, and inspectable way. So I'm using something called RDKit for this tool, and so all a tool is basically the ability of a large language model to call some computational function. These are generally written in Python, but other languages are supported depending upon the language. Virtually every language could do something very similar in, but Python has some features that make it much easier to work in. So the example I'm building off of is something called RDKit, and so RDKit is sort of a Swiss Army knife for computational chemistry, in that it lets you do calculations on molecules and do all kinds of interesting things. If you're interested, you can go and have a look at the documentation to see everything that it can do. But we're focusing on one particular aspect of this, okay, I have a molecule. How do I explain to a large language model what that molecule looks like? And more importantly, how do I encode that molecule as text and be able to do calculations on it, etc. And so there's a couple different ways that you can do this. There's something called SMILES, which is a way of encoding the molecular structure as a string of tokens. There's something called InChi. There's something called isometric SMILES. There's something called selfies. So there's a whole range of these encodings that solve different aspects of capturing the knowledge representation of what a molecule is, which is inherently a three-dimensional thing, in a string of text, right? And so this is just an example. The nice thing about RDKit is it lets you render, so you can actually see the structure. It captures something called stereochemistry, so you can look at stereocentric centers inside of the molecule. Look at the projection of what the actual structure is. So this is just an example of what this thing actually looks like, right? There's another function that's sort of useful in RDKit, and that's going to be the basis of sort of this demonstration. And that basically takes this smile string, right, and figures out which atoms each of these things that are encoded in the smile string refer to, and then based off of this internal database, calculate the molecular weight of the thing that's encoded by the smile string, right? And so there's a function within in the RD kit that basically takes a smile string and returns a molecular weight. All I've done is I've wrapped this for convenience, and I'll show the reason why in a second, right? And so I've created a new Python function that literally just calls the RDKit mole from smiles function, and it returns a molecular weight. But the reason I did this is to simplify the underlying structure so that what the large language model sees, and I'll show that in a second, when I call it, it sees that there's a string and there's a float, right? So it sees this much simpler underlying sort of structure. And importantly, it sees this document string, which basically tells it how to use this function, right? Okay. Well, why does this work? Well, it works because Python has a certain set of metadata because it's an interpreted language, and so each function in Python has some metadata special attributes that are associated with it that then the Python interpreter can use to sort of understand the structure of the function, right? And these things are name, they're the document strings. That's this dunder underscore sort of attribute of the function that returns that information. And so you can print these things out, right? So you can look at this get molecular weight function and print the dunder name, and that will get you the name of the compound. And likewise, there's something called a signature, which basically tells you what the input parameters are for the function and what the output of the function is, right? And then there's the stock string, right? And so this is literally this set of documentation I showed you up here that then gets encoded into that attribute. Okay, so that's great and all, but what does that look like to a large language model? Well, so large language models were fine-tuned to pay certain attention to a structure, a structured response, which encodes a quote-unquote function. So something that it can then return a response that can be parsed by the programming language and then be used to call that actual function, right? So that's all done essentially in your code, right? That handling of the function calling, right? But the trigger for the function calling is the large language model, right? And so for a large language model, you can use this nice tool that was written by the Fast AI and now is supported by Answer AI, called Tools LM, which has this function called getSchema, which returns the schema in a large language model friendly way for what a function looks like, right? And so if I call getSchema and get molecular weight, right, you see that there's a name, there's a description, there's an input schema, there's a set of properties, and it tells it what the required parameters are for the function, right? So that way it knows that I have to call it with a smile string, but there may be other attributes that I don't have to call it with. And so this is a way of describing to the large language model, hey, there's this thing that you can use to answer questions, and this is how you use it, right? That's what this is doing, right? Okay. And so we can actually, within this tool that I'm using called Solve It, which is a product from Answer AI, Um, I can interact with the large language model in a Jupyter notebook in a way that the language model can actually see everything that is in the notebook as cells, right? So whether they're note or code or whatever cells. And so here I'm just asking it, what does the LLM see and how does it invoke a function? It sees the schema, returns a call request, the code intercepts this, and the results go back to the LLM, right? Okay, so that's great and all, but how do we actually get a smiles string into a large language model? Now, I think for a small smiles string, so a simple molecule, we might trust the LLM to be able to generate this, but it wasn't fine-tuned on smile strings. It wasn't, even though it's seen it and it's generalized, and I talk about generalization in a previous talk. So it knows about what a smile string is, and it has sort of this generalization of maybe how to use a smile string. But I wouldn't rely on it to actually do a generation of a smile string based off of a molecular name. It's much more likely, because it's seen chemical names in its training, that it wouldn't hallucinate necessarily a chemical name, right? And so what we've done is we created a second tool for this demonstration. That second tool looks at a database, an online database, which is the database for Wikipedia. It's called Wikidata, that actually has this information in it. And so there's a property that is, there's actually several properties. This one is the isometric smile, so it encodes that stereochemistry that I was talking about, right? And so it basically, for any molecule that's in Wikidata, or for many molecules, if you actually look up that molecule through the API, it will return a sort of key value, if you want to think about it in that way. This is actually a graph, a knowledge graph, but if you want to think about it in terms of maybe JSON or in terms of a dictionary, it's a sort of a key value pair, right? And so it will return something that is P 2017, and that refers to the object of that triple is the string, which is the isometric smiles for that compound, right? That thing that has some identifier that's in Wikidata. And so as an example, we can look at ethanol, right? And so this is ethanol. The identifier for ethanol is that entity in our database is Q153. And so if you go to Wikidata and you type in Q153, it'll give you a web page that shows all of the information that's in the knowledge graph about that compound, including the chemical structure, images, all kinds of information, including crosswalks to other things. It will show measurements and physical values of it, all kinds of useful things. And one of the things that it does show is this smile string, right? And so you'll either have this, in this case, it's a canonical smiles, which is the thing that we're searching for. And so what we've done here is we've created a little function that uses a built-in, or uses a library called requests. And all that does is it lets Python talk through the web to a API and ask for information and get information back, right? And all this function does is it's called get smiles from Wikidata. I actually had the large language model generate this function for me. So it sort of knew based off of what my previous dialogue was, what I was looking for, and that I wanted this structured in a way that a large language model can utilize it as a tool, right? And so I merely, copied and pasted this function, and I ran it in my Jupyter notebook. So now it's executed as code. And then I ask it, I'd like to be able to test this function, right? And so this is a way of sort of getting feedback from my AI in this environment. And it said, well, you can try ethanol, right? Which is the thing that a human would likely have done, right? And so here I just called it by hand with a string called ethanol. And this is the output was another string, which is CCO, which is the smile string for ethanol, right? From, if you recall, when we looked at the web page. Okay, so one other trick that is unique to the Solvit environment, I think is very useful for demonstrating how tools work, which is one of the reasons that I'm using Solvit for this video, is that I can give the AI and solve it any Python function as a tool by just creating either a note or in a dialogue, basically giving it ampersand and backticks of that function name. And that registers that tool with the large language model. That then it can now use that tool in an interactive dialogue with me. And so not all, AIs are built like this. This is a very quirky thing of Solve It, which is quite nice. But it's also quite nice for transparency. So I can sort of show you what's happening behind the scenes as the language model is using this. And so my prompt to the large language model was, could you demonstrate how to use these things right? And so it saw previously that we were talking about ethanol. It went through and said, let me demonstrate gain in molecular weight of ethanol. So it called that tool. So it basically, this is that schema that I showed earlier, right? That there's some sort of ID that's been given to this internally to keep track of which tool has been called. There's a function, get smiles from Wikidata. So that tells Python what function to actually parse and call. And this was the argument that was passed to it, right? And so then when this was called, this tool, this function, talked to Wikidata as a remote database, and then returned this result information, which is CCO, right? And so this was the first step of this agentic loop, which then returns some set of information for a task that the large language model or the AI was trying to perform. And this is, in the previous video, I talked about this React pattern, and I talked about this chain of thought pattern. And internally, it's using those patterns when the large language model is taking in tokens and returning tokens. So behind the scenes, which you don't see here, all these things are sort of going on in the background, right? And so as the next step of this sort of chain of thought is said, okay, I'll use the smile string to calculate the molecular weight. And so as the next step, it uses that smile string, because our get molecular weight function takes in as an argument that string encoding, and it returns a float, right? And so now the large language model, instead of hallucinating the molecular weight of ethanol, it can actually use this RDKit tool to tell me precisely what the molecular weight is, right? And it went through and told, sort of the process by which it accomplished this, right? Now, ethanol is a relatively straightforward molecule, and I think it could reason what the smile string likely is for it, because it's fairly simple. So let's try this with a little bit more complicated example that is of a topic today called semaglutide, right? And so semaglutide is a well, the definition in Wikidata is it's a medication. It's a type of chemical entity, but it's actually a synthetic peptide, right? And so the nice thing about this database is it tells me information structured in a way that a machine can understand of what this thing is, right? So if my AI reads this page, it actually has some context about what this thing is and how it works. But once again, we have a canonical smiles and we have an isometric smiles. So for our purposes here, I'm not differentiating between the two, right, for our example, right? Okay, so the first thing it does is it looks up this, semaglutide, right, as a string. So it does this tool call get smiles from Wikidata. Its chemical name it passes through is semaglutide, and the result is this big long text string, right, which is the smile string. So then, as the second step of this process, right, it called get molecular weight, which then passed in that string just as before, and then returned a result in the terms of the molecular weight. Now, a couple of comments here. So in the previous video, I talked about this idea of context window and hallucination and inaccuracy, and that even though there are ways of increasing the factuality of a large language model, and so there's information that is parametrically encoded in the model. That's probably the most prone to hallucination, right? So it's memorized some things it may not have memorized as Andrew Karpathy says it has this fuzzy recollection of all of this World Wide Web of data that it's read during its training, right? But it's a fuzzy recollection. Now we can sharpen that recollection by giving it information in its context window, and that's the trick that we're doing here. Is that, well, if we give it more focused context, that's an input to the model, that sort of will help the model to be more factual in its output. So that's one of the reasons that we're sort of using this methodology, right? But it can still hallucinate, right? Which is a problem, but it's just less likely to do that. You're more likely to get a factual answer. And so things like smile strings, the model uses this as an input in its context window for then calling the next step of the function, right? And so in essence, this is an input, but it's also an output of the model in the function calling. And so this can be hallucinated. So if you're trying to understand whether or not the model was factual, this is something to keep in mind, right? That through tool use, it's more factual than if you're not using a tool, in all likelihood, particularly with complicated things like calculating a molecular weight. But the fact that this is a string and this is output tokens of the model means that this may not match what the previous set of tokens were. So it will match with some probability, right? So this is a probabilistic output. So I just want everyone to be aware of that there can still be issues and still be mistakes. These models are getting very good though. And so I think this is probably less and less of a problem in comparison with parametric retrieval of information. But like I said, I want everyone to be aware. Once again, we can use, if we're really interested in what the structure of this thing looks like, we can use tools to render that within this environment. So the last thing I'd like to talk about a little bit is that may be of interest to major facilities, and is essentially the driving force behind these large language models, which is software engineering agents, right? And so the economic driver for all of this is essentially to become good programmers, right? And so the Anthropic released last spring something called Claude Code, which is a terminal-based software engineering agent that works with a human to either edit or build software from scratch. It can do it completely autonomously, or it can do it interactively. And as part of that sort of agentic system, there were a couple of tools that are baked into it, which I think are kind of interesting. And those are available also in the Solvit environment, right? Because they tend to be very useful tools for large language models. And this is the ability to essentially search for information on the file system of your computer, or a remote computer. The ability to load parts of a file into its context window, to selectively load parts of a file. The file is very long, and you want to search through and find the relevant line numbers, and then load that information into its context window. It needs to be able to create new files. It needs to be able to insert information, as I said, into the file. And it may want to replace strings. So this sort of search and replace, that's part of many code editors. It has a tool to do that, right? And so this general set of tools, general purpose order tools, which sort of follow the Unix philosophy that they do one thing, they do it well, and they can be combined together to do more powerful things, right? And so if you're interested in this is, I think there's a lot of research and discussion about how to make effective tools for large language models. There is a very good document, once again, by Anthropic that is linked here, that goes into much more of a deep dive. They talk about something called Model Context Protocol. And what that is an emerging standard for essentially letting models use remote tools. Right. So if I create a set of tools and I want to expose that to any agent without going through the process that I just explained, I can use a MCP that would then wrap Wikidata, right, with these functions that then the large language model could call. Right? There's pluses and minuses to this, but that's what MCP is. You may have heard it as a buzzword. It's a way that you can connect databases and information to the underlying model. There's other ways that you can do this, which we'll demonstrate as this video series goes on. But this is a pretty nice, first principles document. They give an example of get weather, but they get hints on what they've learned in the process of writing Claude code, what makes an effective tool. And if you're thinking about how LLMs, interact with a large facility cyber infrastructure, it's likely going to interact with that cyber infrastructure through tool use, right? And so the relevancy to this to large facilities is that at some point in time, major facilities are going to be writing, tools that either do science or interact with their cyber infrastructure or are, part of an agentic system that's doing things on behalf of the human. And so understanding how to write good tools that consistently produce good results with good accuracy that are introspectable and observable so that the human understands what's going on behind the scenes. Like I said, you can have hallucination. And that's one of the advantages about being able to actually look at the details of what actually happened between the large language model and the tool, particularly when you're doing the development. So in any case, I hope that this video has been useful in explaining what tool use, how that is part of an agentic system, which we'll talk about in the next video. What's an agent? Why does an agent need tools? How does it use tools? All those sorts of things. And once again, if you're affiliated with a major mid-scale facility, we invite you to register. So registration details will be coming up underneath the video below, along with links to all of the relevant information. So thank you for your time.